Welcome to the Joy of Automating. I'm Franklin Weber. In this episode, we are going to focus on refactoring the test suite of a cookbook. A test suite should bring us joy, being clear, concise, and execute fast. It often starts that way, but it never seems to end that way. We're going to look at an existing cookbook. We're going to make sure that the test suite works, that it's got good coverage, and then we're going to reduce the redundancy. And we're on the way, we're going to explore some of the powerful features of RSpec. And like I said, I'm going to show you today how a test suite can be joyful, and it can bring you lots of excitement and fun when you're working with it. All right, let's get started. All right, well, let's get started. Like I said, we're going to use a community cookbook, and actually we're going to use a community cookbook that I shamefully I own, and I haven't been managing very well. But 2 years ago when I started to own it, there was a lot that I had to learn about it, and particularly there was a lot that I brought to the table when I started working with it. I had a lot of experience, or I have a lot of experience with Ruby and RSpec and testing, so I wanted to bring it up to date in terms of its test suite. What I've done is sort of gone back in time and recreated the test suite as it was when I initially implemented it, before I started doing some of the crazy RSpec sort of magical things to it. And I want to explore some of that today, taking sort of what looks like a test suite that just sort of scrolls on for days and days, and then really refine it down to something, like I said, more concise and more beautiful. Okay, well, let's take a look at it. Here is the actual project. There's a community cookbook arc, like I said. This is a version of it. And in this case, this cookbook is my variation on it. So I've taken the test suite, I sort of I refactored it back to sort of a more simpler version, at least to initially understand. But there's a lot of duplication and complexity that goes along with it. So you're welcome to download that and join along with me. I have this locally, so I'm going to pull that up. So here's the ARC cookbook. I've got it locally downloaded on my machine, and what I'm going to do is start to explore the code within it to kind of give you an idea. Now, where I normally start is with the test suite when I want to read things. This one at the moment, I don't believe has an integration test suite. It only has this test suite that goes through and sort of manages all the expectations for what the default recipe should do. You'll see here, here on the left-hand side, I'm inside of the spec directory recipes default spec right there. So I'm in the one and only recipe there is. And if actually you look inside of this cookbook, you'll see there is only one recipe. This one recipe right here does most of the things. The ARC is a cookbook that provides a custom resource for other cookbooks to use to install their application. So if you look at the default recipe here, all it does is it installs a number of dependencies in terms of package dependencies for the ARC process to work. And of course, if it's on the Windows system, it installs the 7-zip recipe, which I think will install 7-zip on the system. If you look in the attributes file, you'll find that there's a lot of complicated logic here, and this is stuff that's ripe for ChefSpec in terms of unit testing, because you'll see that it sets up a bunch of attributes, but then there's this case statement here where it switches between the platform to figure out what's going on with it in terms of like, is this the right platform? Is this the right executable to run? And of course they use tar as sort of the default name for the unzipping application. And then here, This right here is probably the most complicated code within the entire cookbook. There is more complicated code, of course, inside of the libraries, and that's something that we could explore if we have time. But right here, this is all the logic that tries to figure out which packages need to be installed based on what operating system. And you notice there's not a lot of rhyme or reason or consistency to how this is implemented in any way. Sometimes it's saying if not. The unless word is the same as saying if not. So if you're not on Mac and Windows, if you're not on Mac, Windows, and FreeBSD, if you are on Mac and Windows, or not Mac and Windows, if you're not on Red Hat Enterprise, Fedora, Mac OS, SUSE, so there's a lot of these not cases. And then there's some positive cases saying like if you are on here or you're on here, if you're on this platform or that platform. And this is a lot of logic to try and troubleshoot, and of course multiple platforms, it'd be rather difficult to figure out. So what we're going to do is explore this code from the test perspective. So let me open up that test file. So again, I'm in the default _ spec file, the one and only test. There's a number of things here. So if I just scroll along, I think this test file is about 200 lines. And it's pretty clear. It's laid out correctly. It's got a lot of things going for it in terms of like its coverage of platforms and things like that. Before I actually read it, I'm going to execute it to see if there's any problems with it. So let's go for that. So I'm going to go to the command line and I'm going to type in chef exec RSpec. And actually, I think I've got RSpec installed already. I probably should stick with that because I have a specialized version just up to date for me. But we'll see if this works. Some little warnings, but oh, I got some failures. I think this because I've got some requirements. The reason why these are failing, and you might have this experience as well, it depends on your Chef version. So if I show you my Chef development kit version, I've got 0.10.0. The only reason I'm having this installed and not upgraded to the latest was I found a bug in 0.12 that was causing me some problems with Test Kitchen, so I've not upgraded. And the error actually is telling me that there's a permission denied issue here, and it's telling me that on all the platforms that I'm working with, in this case CentOS 6.7, FreeBSD 10.2, and if I scroll down, I think it's the Mac versions as well. Essentially, it can't open this file. It says permission denied, but really what it should be saying, it should be a embedded error. And FOHI, the thing that fakes OHI information for these platforms, is essentially doesn't have these values. So I have an up-to-date version of FOHI and essentially ChefSpec installed, which uses it. So I'm just going to run RSpec essentially outside of the Chef development kit. And I should see a passing test suite. Okay, so there's a number of warnings here. I'm not concerned about them, but every one of those little dots are passing tests. I have some warnings about ChefSpec perhaps using Windows package, and that's okay. The tests finish in about 4 seconds, which is great. And so I've got some good coverage here as well. So you see this, I've got some good coverage numbers. Not always important to have great coverage numbers. 100% is not your goal, but it's nice in this case to make sure when coming into a test suite, I do have all the paths covered in terms of the packages and things like that. So this looks like a good place to start. So now that I feel confident about the code in the sense of like what it's trying to accomplish, and I know the test suite's working, let's actually spend some time looking at the test suite. I'm going to collapse a few things. So your editor of choice should have the ability to understand areas of code and be able to collapse them. I think that's useful because here I can break down or sort of shrink up where the overarching goals. Remember with RSpec and really with ChefSpec, you're defining these contexts within another context. And so in this case, what we're saying is when applying the ARC cookbook's default recipe, or essentially, well, maybe not applying, but when I build the run list for, when I build the resource collection for this recipe, I expect to see a number of things. And first and foremost, it looks like I've got one that says the unspecified platform. That'd be weird if it didn't have a specified platform, but we have that case. We have CentOS, Debian, FreeBSD, Mac OS, etc., etc. So there's a lot of great coverage in terms of that. Well, let's open up one of these at a time to kind of get an idea of what's happening. I'm going to go with the unspecified platform. It looks like here we've got this let, which sets up a solo runner. Generally, I think by default, the Chef development kit now sets up a server runner. That's okay. That works for us, the solo runner. It says it installs the necessary packages. So on a default, essentially unspecified platform, these are actually the packages that should be installed. There's some things I dislike about this in the sense that, if there was an error here, I wouldn't be able to see any of the remaining issues if they were to come up. So that's something to be aware of. And something that we want to possibly take a look at. Now, let's go through the rest of this right here. So let's take a look at, it does not install GCC C++ package. Okay. So we also have some things where it says it does not install this. So I guess it felt important that some of these things, these packages, are not installed. And by default on an unspecified platform, it does not include the 7-zip recipe. Right, because the 7-zip recipe was only for Windows when we're on a Windows platform. And then there's a number of other things being set here. There's some attributes being found. So you can actually test for attributes with ChefSpec by essentially asking the chef run object to give you the node object, and then you can request that, essentially that attribute from it. There might be an easier way of doing that, but this person, or at least me, when I chose to implement this a while ago, essentially came up with this as a solution. Ask the chef run to give me the node for the attribute, and then compare the attribute value to what I expect it to be. This continues on. It looks like a number of attributes are set, and that makes a lot of sense. And then it says, again, for tar binary. So this seems pretty straightforward, and this is pretty clear. I think what makes this test complicated, this sort of test suite complicated, is that we're going to see a lot of repetition and a lot of just sort of redundant code that's all throughout this. So you see here, when we move in just to the next section, we're going to see something that's very similar, right? We're going to see a flow that's so similar to the other one. We're going to see, in this case, the chef run setup. There's a slight difference in this one. And then, of course, it installs the necessary packages. This list is probably different. But again, it took a long time probably to copy and paste and then refill and sort of add these things. In the future, as we sort of change these values, it might be complicated to figure out or to write or sort of manage. All right. And I don't see any sort of specific attributes here that are set. But let's continue on. Ubuntu, yeah, so there's some more different set of attributes here for FreeBSD. It seems FreeBSD has a different attribute set for the binary. It seems for Mac OS we have a different tar binary, a different set of necessary packages installed. And I think now we get a good idea, or hopefully you're getting a good idea as well as I have at this point, of what's each little section taking care of. So like I said, everything is working, but this just feels like a lot of redundancy, and I'd like to look at a way we can start to clean this up, because like I said, a nice test suite is one that is easy to manage, and it's kind of light, succinct, and is clear. And while I think this is laid out well, I don't think it's that clear in terms of its execution. So let's take a look at how we can refactor this. So first and foremost, there's things that we can do inside of here to start out to kind of make things a little bit easier to read. I think the first part would perhaps be looking at really these package sections within every one of these blocks that are available, right? So all these examples have multiple expectations set up. And I go back and forth on whether I think multiple expectations should be in an example or not. I tend to believe that it should be one example, one expectation, and that's something that, in some cases I break the rule depending on the situation. But here, let's start with just sort of making this a little clearer. Now, one way we could do that is if really we're kind of repeating this code right here, right? We're taking this code and we're kind of repeating it. And I'm just going to extract it here. It really is, we want to say something like insert package name here, right? And we want to do this, right? Do this for all the packages that I care about. Right, we want to use looping or some sort of iteration to sort of move through all the packages I care about, and then kind of figure out which one to do. Essentially fill that value or sort of substitute that value in there. So we can do that. First, we should kind of isolate or sort of talk about what packages we care about. So let's just write down or make a variable called packages, and that's going to be our array. And let's define all of our packages that we need. So this is an array in Ruby, and really I'm defining an array of strings, and so this will allow me to define this information. And some of you might be thinking, well, there might be a better way of doing this, but I want to start in small steps and work up to larger refactoring as we move along. So here's all the packages I care about. Now that I have all the packages I care about, I can use this line here, sort of replacing this iteration. I can say for every package, package.each do package name, and I'll indent this to show the loop here. So we're saying for every one of the packages, each one of them needs to run against this code right here. So take each one of these packages. So first take libtool, right? Take libtool, shove that in there. Take autocomp, shove that in there. Unzip, shove that in there, right? That's what we're doing here. And I can comment this out, and hopefully I've got this correct. So let's comment this out. Let me make sure. Libtool, autocomp, unzip, rsync, make gcc autogem. Okay, let's save that. Now this is where I'm going to run my test suite to make sure that everything looks good. I'm going to put that at the bottom there and execute it. Okay. And then we should see some success. Again, yes. All right, so that looks pretty good. So I feel pretty good about this initial refactoring we did, right? This is definitely easier to write, definitely clearer to write. If we were winning essentially on the number of lines, this would be a good way to start. Now, this is something that a lot of times with test suites, having spent a lot of time writing tests, when you set up a test suite, there's really, or sort of an example, there's a kind of 3 stages of it. You might call it like given, when, then. A lot of times, I've also heard it as assign, act, and then assert as well. So there's many different ways that people describe it that I've heard within the community of developers. And so the given is kind of like this. Given we have these packages, when there's no real when here, the when is kind of taken care of by the chef run object. I guess we could say when chef run and then make all the assertions here. We really don't need this. It's sort of, you know, superfluous with the essentially the rest of these things. So I'm going to remove this when. But we kind of have that given and then here. And that feels about right. But something I've noticed is that with examples in RSpec, it sometimes almost feels better if you can actually get some of these givens outside of the block right here. So I'm going to do that. I think that's the first thing I want to do, is to move these givens outside the block. Because before I go on to any of the others, because there are, you know, essentially the same pattern I'm going to repeat over and over again, I kind of want to refine this process a little bit more and see if I can get some extra sort of mileage out of what I've got going on. So there's a helper, and let's look at it actually in the documentation before I use it. So I'm going to open up the documentation for RSpec. So the documentation for RSpec can be found here at this website called Relish App. RSpec is being tested by another testing framework called Cucumber, and then they publish everything to this Relish App website. So you can see the latest versions. Now, I know this let helper, we're not going to see the version we actually expect to see with our gem, but a lot of times you will see, you know, close to how it's being used. The functionality of let hasn't changed over the years. Now, RSpec is a meta gem, so there's many gems that it maintains and manages. And what that means is there's a core gem, let me go back here. There's a core gem. Yep, let's go back. There's a core gem, there's an expectations gem, and then there's a mocks gem. And the Rails is kind of separate. That's a separate gem that manages. What the meta gem does is coordinate all its version numbers. So when you install RSpec, it's saying I'll take 3.4 of this, 3.3 of that, 3.4.1 of this. You know, so it allows a coordination of these gems, so you can kind of version each one of those separately, and also have them separately if you need to use them separately. So I'm going to go here and I'm going to do some searching. So I know there's a helper called let. And this let helper is something that's super useful for sort of describing a scenario in which I want to describe like a, you know, sort of conditions for myself. You might think of them as givens in some way. And here's an example of a let. It's saying, I'm going to make this bigger. It's saying in a describe here, let the count equal some global variable plus equals 1. And then we're saying, I expect the count to equal 1. I expect the count to equal 2. And this is not cached across the examples. So we expect the count to equal 1 and continue to equal 1, but not to equal 2 a second time. So in our case, it's kind of using it. So notice count is being used here, but this let kind of defines it up above. So this is exactly what we could be doing, right? If we look back at the code that we're writing, and I'm going to do that here, we see this packages right here, and we're using this package right here to kind of execute this code. So we could move this to a let, and I think that would make it a little bit clearer. So we could say, let the packages equal this right here. And I think in the example, if I go back to it, yeah, it's using this, the curly braces syntax. Now, there's nothing magical. You can either use let packages like this with the curly braces or with the do and end. Really, these oftentimes mean the same thing. Ruby developers may choose to use one over the other when there's a one-line situation. So I'm just going to immediately drop this code inside of here. I'm going to use the do and end, but know that you can always bring in the curly braces if you like. I'm just going to delete that given. So now if we look at this code, I think this is this code. It's a little clearer in terms of like what's being asserted here. And I'm going to actually delete this because I know this is an assertion. Here it's telling us now when I read this that it installs the necessary packages, packages.each, and then outside of the test I can read it. I can say the context is when no attributes are specified on an unspecified platform, let the chef run do this, be set up this way, let packages be this, and then we're asserting in this case that the packages are essentially installed on the system. We should, of course, run this, test this to make sure this is working. Okay. And we'll see that content there. All right, everything is good. So I feel pretty confident about the changes we made. I'm starting to feel pretty good about the test suite because I now know that I can go forward and make some changes like this to the rest of the test suite. But again, right before I leave this area, I am going to make just a few more sort of minor modifications. I'm always picky. I just want to make sure things are just right. Before I leave, I want to do this. You can express arrays in this way, but you can also express arrays in a simpler way. And you can use this %w character. And if we use the %w character, it really sets up this white space delimited array. And so as long as you have these essentially single word, like as long as there's no white space between these items, really you can define an array this way. And this is one of those things that I had trouble sort of accepting at first, but immediately when you see this compared to that and trying to write this second statement on line 13 here, this feels much better. And essentially when I get down to the other ones, I'm going to save myself a ton of time by having this. So I'm going to let the packages be this right here. And let's run this again. So that's one little, again, another little minor modification I like to use. So I start out with the other one just to kind of make it clear, and then, yeah, that looks good. So here we go. I expect the packages this way. Now, I mentioned before, what I dislike is, imagine I had something like this, gtar inside of here. I'm going to purposely create a failure because what I want to do is illustrate the point that if there's a failure in this gtar right here, imagine there's a failure at the end like gtar2 or something like that. I'm going to get one failure, only one failure, but I'm not going to get the second failure. So let me show you how that is. So because we've kind of combined all the expectations all into one, I will only get one failure when I probably want to get two failures. And that's something that you have to decide when you sort of combine these expectations into a single example. So you see here one failure, but then there's all these other sort of untouched resources by test. So not only do I not get the second failure, but my coverage changes in terms of my report. And that's because I'm batching up all these expectations. When it hits the first failure, RSpec is going to quit. And that's something that's not ideal a lot of the time. So we may choose to do something different, which is we may choose to take a different approach in how we define these packages. So let me take a little change here. So notice that we have the loop and we say, hey, let's loop over the packages. Well, there's nothing stopping us from taking this loop. Well, there might be something stopping us, but let's just assume this is going to work. Taking this loop and moving outside of the expectation. So I'm going to move it outside. I'm going to put an end here. So why couldn't we just put the loop around here and then specify the package name, and then will that work here? So let's try this out as a kind of way of refactoring it, because this would actually set up a number of examples equal to the number of packages. And of course, if one failed, it wouldn't stop the other from failing. Now, I have a feeling we're going to learn something about RSpec when we do this time. All right, and we get a failure here, and it says something about this. It says method missing packages is not available on an example group, describe context or something like that. It's only available from within individual examples inside the it block. So really, while we did that sort of let statement, the let statement doesn't work outside. Essentially, this package is not defined. The that let helper only works inside of the example itself. So we could change this. Here's one way we could do it. We could say, well, maybe we don't want a let helper. Maybe we just want a normal method to return these values. So I'm going to change this to a method. So easily, just like that, I can change that to a method. I'm going to comment this one out just to kind of show this. And now we need to figure out, is this exactly what we want? So do we want a method, a little helper method? Ooh, did I get that right? It says method missing packages is not available on an example group. I've defined packages here. Maybe this isn't available. Maybe I didn't save it. So let's try running it one more time. I'll move that to the bottom. Hopefully I've got this right here. No, it seems like this doesn't work either. So maybe this doesn't work. So what if I move packages outside of the context of this thing? Now this I don't like because this is moving the packages away from the context of which is executing. Maybe this will work, but this concerns me, and it does, right? So it does work, but this is not an ideal situation, right? It's telling me GTAR is a failure. It's telling me GTAR2 is a failure. It's telling me there's 2 failures, which I thought there would be, and it allows me to finish the test suite. There's still some level of like, hey, there's some coverage that's not working, but ultimately our coverage does work at the end. So we do get the right coverage, but what I don't like is that these packages or this sort of packages thing is defined outside of it. Or if I were to come into this test suite and look at it, I would think, what is packages doing outside here? Like what packages? Whose packages? I might say like unspecified platform packages, but really that would mean for every one of the future changes I make down below for every platform, I'd also have to make that change. So I don't like that either. I think what I'm going to do is stick with this other version that's going on. Now, if somebody else has an example or an idea inside of the chat room here, I'd love to hear it. But I'm just going to move it back and sort of bring it back to what we had before. So I'm going to go with this. I don't like this, but I don't like the alternative any better. Okay. So I've made the change back, and let's get my big fat head out of the way here. And yep, there we go. And let's get going here. All right, so this should work, and I feel pretty confident that we're going to get our one failure, the GTAR one, which I added, but we get our wrong coverage. So we'll live with that for right now. So I'm going to remove those 2 bad examples that I included here and rerun this. And I think I feel much better about this implementation if everything passes again. Yep, I feel much better about this implementation versus sort of any other sort of option at this moment, but kind of showing you what's possible, that you could use methods on top of just these helpers. So if the lets are a little too confusing, I like using them, but we could do something else. So let's do some quick refactoring of some of the remaining, at least another section, just so you can kind of see this, this process again. Okay. And then we'll come back to this attributes part, because I think there's some good refactoring there as well. All right, so let's take the same example here. What I really like about this is instead of me doing the same processing, well, actually, let me do the same process again. I think that's important. So let's see this. Let packages do an end. I'm going to set up that array, right? So I'm going to do that. And I'm going to define all those packages. So libtool, and I kind of like a space. I don't know what RuboCop and Food Critic says about that, but today I'm going to be me. I'm going to do what I want to do. And then I'll let that sort of complain at me later. bzip2 and tar. Okay, so that feels pretty good. And now I can take this code and I'm going to comment it out, not just delete it yet, because I want to just make sure I verify that I've got everything here in case I get some sort of problem with the coverage. And I'm going to do that same line again. Packages each do, package name do, end. And then I am going to write out what I expect the chef run to install package name. All right. Let's run this again. So that feels pretty good. It looks very similar to the last one. I feel pretty confident in our choice here. And I really think that cleans up a lot of duplication in our test suite. All right. That's good. We've got 41 resources touched, 41 coverage, 19 examples, 0 failures. So that feels pretty good. So I'm going to delete the remainder and feel pretty confident about the choice that we're making here. But let's talk about something really quickly. It seems like really this starts to look very similar to this. So look at this. It installs necessary packages. If I go up here, it installs necessary packages. And then I see that it says let packages. So really, I could copy this code, right? I don't have to keep recreating this every single time. I can kind of copy this let helper in this example. And of course, I need to modify the let helper each time. But really, I think I can kind of copy this here. I can paste this here. And I can go, is libtool here, autocomp there, unzip is there, rsync is there, make is there, gcc is there. And this is where I probably should just delete it and sort of rebuild it so I don't have any sort of weirdness of this. pkg config, so I'll delete that. I'm going to just run this both side by side and actually not comment anything out, and then run this and see what happens. My coverage should be the same, my test values should be the same, everything should really just work the same. I really just have a redundant test or a redundant example over top of it. So that looks good. So now I'm going to decommission this one. And we can continue on throughout this. Now, this is interesting. So this is one of those situations where I go, I seem to be repeating myself, and I seem to be repeating myself. And here's one of those moments where we can decide, is this enough? Like, should I repeat myself? Is this an okay amount of duplication? Does this make it clear to me and to the possible future users that kind of come to this cookbook? And I think this might be, but remember, we're practicing today. And because we're practicing, that allows us to shave the yak a little bit more, have a little bit more fun. And so I want to start exploring some of the more, like I said, interesting parts of RSpec. And so let's do that. I think that's going to be exciting. So I want to look at a way that we can share this example. So we don't need to share the helper, right? We see this is changing every single time, but this isn't changing every single time. So this example that we keep repeating here keeps appearing in every one of our tests that we go forward. So really, I don't want to repeat it in the next one here. What I'd love to do is say, just do the thing like, hey, make sure, define packages. So I would define the let helper. So it'd be nice if I said something like this. Let the packages do this, right? I define the packages helper here and say, yep, you've got libtool, you've got autoconf, you've got unzip, you've got rsync, gmake, GCC, AutoGen, and gtar. You've got all those things inside of you. And it's really, at this point, I wish it was just saying, like, make sure you've got all the necessary packages. So it's like, test for necessary packages, right? And I don't really want to have to keep writing that. So let's do that. Let's explore one possible way we can do that. And it seems like we want to share an example, right? We want the same example over and over again, this example repeated, but we don't want to keep repeating this example. We wish we could say, let's share this example between all of them, because example seems pretty clearly, being the same every single time. The input's a little bit different. So I'm going to look up a thing called shared examples. So shared examples is going to allow us in RSpec the ability to share examples between it. So here you'll see it says shared examples let you describe behavior of classes or modules. In our case is really, we might think of this as class or module or platforms. When declared, a shared group's content is stored. It is only realized in a context of another example group. So we can use a shared example by describing it like this. It behaves like, it should behave like, it includes examples. So we might go with something like this. But here's the setup for it. You define something like this here. You say, hey, here's a shared example, the name of the shared example. You put all your example stuff inside of here, any example information, any let helpers and all that stuff. And then within your describe, you can always just ignore the sort of RSpec part. In the describe, you just refer to that example that you described over here. So this says some example there. So we could do that. So that's what I want to do. I want to try setting that up. So let's define a shared example. Let's call it necessary packages, and let's see if we can save ourselves that work. So here we go. So the shared example thing. So it says, I type shared examples. I'll call this the necessary packages shared example. And between the do and the end, I can paste that shared example code. So let's take this bit right here. We'll just copy this out. And I'm going to paste this in. And so this is just the shared example that sort of describes this. Now, remember, using this or invoking a shared example requires us to just say something like this at the top. Include examples, or in this case, include examples, right? Include examples and then the name of the example. And it seems we can even pass parameters. So we could even get crazier, which is we could even define that. So here, include examples, and I'm going to say necessary packages. Okay? Now, I'm not sure this is exactly where I'd go with this implementation of this sort of refactor, but again, like I said, it's fun to sort of explore these things and see what's going on with it. All right, so let's run the test. Let's see if it works, and then we'll remove those other things. That looks good. All right, I'm excited about that. So that's kind of a crazy way we could essentially get rid of repeating this. And we could go through and refactor, you know, all of these right here, and we could replace that here, and we could replace that here if we wanted, right? So we could do this. So then necessary packages, and we might decide that maybe necessary packages is what? Including necessary packages, what? What is happening with necessary packages? Well, let's clean up this one as well. Then we'll talk about maybe the changing the name of it. So this implementation, I've changed it in a number of places. Let's run the test again, make sure it's working. Oops, see, that's why I want to make the test before we kind of make any more changes. Could not find shared example necessary packages. Oh, so I'm using necessary packages, and let's see what line number it's failing on. So I jump a little bit too much, but it's telling me that it cannot find it in the default spec. So this is really a big long stack trace. It says RSpec recipes default spec line 14. So let's look at line 14. So I don't think I did anything different. I just said include examples. But you know what? I think from my experience, this shared example is defined down below. So I think what needs to happen is I need to move this up. So I'm going to move this up to the top. And I'm going to move this up here. I'm just going to put it like right. Can I just put it right? Actually, can I just put it right at the top? Yeah. All right, let's move it right at the top. Let's see what happens there. Outside of the describe, does it need to be in a describe? What I saw from the documentation, it doesn't look like it. And when I execute this, this solves the issue, and I think it clearly sort of sets up the situation that I'm hoping for. But let's talk about this a little bit. I chose necessary packages, but really, I guess what I should say is it installs necessary packages. So I guess what I'd hope for is that if you have this string, I really don't want necessary packages, I want installs necessary packages. So I'm going to use a little helper inside of Atom, which is Command D or probably Control D on Windows or on Ubuntu or CentOS. I'm going to grab all the text that matches the same. And now I've got multiple cursors, and I'm just going to say installs necessary packages. So this should say installs necessary packages. This says necessary packages. So it's a bit of a repetition, but I like it. I think it's clearer when it says include examples, installs necessary packages. Run RSpec and wait for patiently here for the results, and my coverage is good. Now, this is one of those moments where this helper right here that I've defined, I think it's not so great at the top. If I were to be coming into this recipe and this spec and sort of trying to figure out what is happening here, I don't think it's a great idea to have this code up at the top. And this is the perfect moment for us to move this into, see this file right here, it says require spec helper. That spec helper is there actually to help you. I mean, that's what it's there for, right? Spec helper. The helper file, the reason why you require it is because inside of the spec helper file, all this content gets loaded every single time, no matter what specification you run. So this is the perfect moment for us to move this in here. So now that we've defined this sort of golden, good example that'll probably work across multiple things, as long as you define the let helper for packages or something for packages, this should work for us. I'm going to move this into the spec helper, and I'm going to save the file, and I'm going to go back to our default spec. I'm going to make sure it's gone from here. I'm going to save the file, and I'm going to rerun this again. So again, little baby steps, little refactoring, and I think this will probably make it a little bit even more clear about what's going on. But That does pass. But now realize you have created a little bit of what some people will complain as a bit of magic, right? So in some cases, moving this includes installs necessary packages might be difficult for someone new to the cookbook and the test suite to figure that out. So if you make that choice, be aware of that choice. And again, like I said, we're playing here today, so it's a nice experience, so we can try that out. Okay. So I've got a bunch more other little things to get to, so I'm going to leave this sort of idea here. There's a number of other, of course, suites down below, the sort of context down below that we could address, but I'll leave that for you if you'd like to do that, walk through that process. And it's probably a pretty straightforward one, right? Okay. Now, let's talk about this one, not the not install, not the not include, because those ones seem pretty standard, not unique in any way. I don't see a lot of repetition. But what I do see is some repetition here. So let's look at these attributes that are being set. So number one, I see attribute equals chef run node arc Apache mirror. Attribute equals chef run node arc prefix root. Attribute equals chef run node, and you get the idea. While I don't see the same value every single time, I think what's been done, which is nice in this series of tests, is that they all have a very similar format. So I can see that really the only thing that's different is this right here. Right? I can see that the attribute being asked for is different. Now, I think that's something that we could do to make this a little bit clearer. So we could say let the node be this thing. So I'm going to use the curly braces, and we could say, well, why not chefrun.node, right? And so we could say, why not node right here? That would save or sort of clean up some things, That would, of course, make it probably a little bit clearer. We could reduce that chefrun dot. And that's a small refactor we can do, right? That's a simple, small change that can take place. But even further, if we look, even if we went through and said, hey, every one of these chef run dots, and I could grab all of them, right? And then replace them with node using my helper, run the test. I still don't feel like this is as good as it could be. So again, similar to the other situation, I want to see, could I get this even better? You notice there's another pattern too. When you're testing your cookbook for attributes, you're oftentimes testing the same attribute every time, right? So you're saying like, hey, look inside of arc for this, look inside for arc for that, look inside for this, for that. And so we might even go further and say, well, why not say something like cookbook attribute, and we want maybe like, or I'm not sure the right name for it because it's really the node, but it's the node defined cookbook attribute. So in some cases, I'm not sure exactly what I'd call this. Let's just call this, cookbook attribute or cookbook attributes, right? So that's kind of it. And we'll call this node dot, or actually node, and then the name of the cookbook here. So I'm just going to repeat that. All right, so now I could do cookbook attributes, right? And I could say that cookbook attributes Apache mirror. Let's just run one of these to see if this works before I make the change wholeheartedly across the others. And of course, I don't want to make that change if I don't feel right about it. It feels weird that I am saying cookbook attributes. I mean, is it assumed that I'm in the attributes of the cookbook? I don't know. And in some cases, maybe this is not, node attributes for cookbook. This is where we could sort of bike shed on what the implementation happens to be. The nice part too is I could probably take this and just put this in here and then delete this. That does bust my 80 lines. You see here's my sort of highlight here. This is like 80 lines or 80 columns right here. So I don't really like that I go over. So I think I'm going to stick with the original. But that means or makes me think that maybe I could define this the same. So before I use attributes, I want to just take a moment. Is attributes something that is being used? So let's pause the execution for a second. I'm going to run RSpec. I'm going to run spec default spec, or actually spec recipes default spec on line 28. So I'm going to run one specification at once, just one, because I want to pause and I want to see what's going on with it. And I'm going to use an ls, and this ls inside of pry will let me see all the available methods here. And I'm just going to do a search, so I can use a question mark or a forward slash. The forward slash is of course going to look forward through it, and I'm going to look for, in this case, attributes. So is there anything called attributes? Have attributes. So there is a matcher called have attributes. That might be something that I could be using. and I don't see anything else. Cookbook attributes. Oh, well, I define this one right here, cookbook attributes, right? So there's attribute itself. That's a local variable. That's the one that I configured and created. But it doesn't look like there's anything called attributes that I could specifically say. Maybe there's something in ChefSpec. I don't know. But we'll implement something, and then if we're being redundant or doing something different, we'll get some feedback in a code review. So I'll do an exit. I think that we should just go with attributes, right? Let's just go with attributes. Oh, and we'll do this. Attributes. We'll just say attribute itself, because we're only going to ask for one attribute. And I think in this case, we could do attribute Apache mirror should be this. And I think that's all right. It is a little weird that it says attribute. But, that's maybe, okay. So again, we could bike shed on this and sort of figure this out. But I could see this. It looks like we have one example. So everything works, and I'm just going to make the change. I'm going to go with this right now until, maybe someone says otherwise. So that feels all right to me. It feels like it works right. Another way we could have done it, of course, is to define attribute. And if you give it an attribute, there's the attribute name, right? The name of the attribute. We could say something like this. We could say, grab the chef run .node, and then but I don't think a chef run would be available inside of here. Because we could change this from square brackets to parentheses, and that might be all right. So I'm gonna leave it as is, like I said. So let's delete. So the nice part is we're kind of saving ourselves all of this. We'll delete all that, and now we put this in here. Ooh, that feels good. I mean, it's not perfect, but it feels good in terms of what's going on. And we could do that again. All right, so I could do that again. Now, I think that feels probably pretty good, and we could again go through and kind of work through that process. Look for the remaining ones that are found within the rest of this spec file, and then of course fix them all to look very similar to this. So oops, I just ran the one test, not all the tests. And this is one of those moments where it's like, yeah, we could go through the rest of them, but I encourage you to do that if you like to play with this let helper. And you notice I have a let helper in this moment, a let helper pulling in another let helper. So the node doesn't exist, but once this calls, it calls this right here. I could have done the chef run node and sort of defined that inside of this right here, but I don't mind being more explicit, like sort of clear about I'm asking for the node, whatever the node happens to be if that value were to change. And I'd rather use that as the interface than instead of always going back to the chef run object. So thinking about the interface, the communication that's happening here, I think that's clearer. Now again, I'm not in love with the attribute as a name, but I feel like that's pretty good. So there's a few more situations where this could change as well, but I think like that clarifies a lot of things here. Now, another thing that I think would be really good for a test suite is actually clearing up the redundancy that we see, or not the redundancy, but the sort of situation where all these platforms are in the same default file. I think this is a simple one. So one thing that we could do right now is take all this, and I think what I'd like to do within the recipes directory, define each one of these platforms and then define these or move this spec inside of there. So I'm going to do it for one of them or two of them just to kind of get you the feel, but ultimately I think this is something that you could do as well. So let's organize these because I think this file is too huge. It's too hard to read, and I think making separate directories for each platform would probably be a great choice in terms of helping for clarity and things like that. Okay. So let's go into command prompt, and so I'm going to go to my terminal. I am going to now say inside of the RSpec directory. So let's go into the RSpec directory. RSpec, the spec directory, and I'm in the recipes directory. That's where I've decided to store everything. There's my one default spec. I am now going to, in this case, make a directory for my platforms that I'm interested in. And I'm just going to do a few. So I'll do a make dir CentOS, make dir Debian, make dir FreeBSD, right? I can continue on and sort of work those out. Now, within each one of those directories, I need a default _ spec.rb, right? So that's the name of the recipe still. So I need that, and there's probably a faster way here that I could do that, but I don't know it right now. So FreeBSD default _ spec.rb, right? So I'm going to create those, and now I'm just going to take all this code right here. Actually, I'll just copy this, and I'm just going to go in CentOS. I'm going to paste this. Oh, I should copy it with That's right. I should copy with the spec helper. So let's just copy with the spec helper. Down the FreeBSD. Really, if I was doing this, I'd just kind of copy all of it. Yeah, that's probably the best way of doing it. Copy, paste, and really, so this is not unspecified platform, right? So in our case, delete, close. This goes all the way down to the bottom. I don't care about any of this, right? And so that looks good. And because I'm loading the spec helper, this should all work for me. And in the same way, I go back to the default spec, copy everything. Let's go to Debian. I'm a big fan of just kind of copying everything. And I don't remember when I figured that out. I was like, just copy everything instead of just trying to cut the pieces out. Mostly because I think I would make less mistakes. So here I grab the Debian one, and I could go all the way down and kind of delete that. And then for finally FreeBSD, I think I've still got this in my paste buffer. Good. So I go here. I don't need this one. I don't need this one. I probably should learn the shortcut key for collapsing. That would be a really useful one in this situation. And I'm in Debian. No, not in Debian. I'm in FreeBSD. So delete this one. Here's FreeBSD. And I'm going to comment the rest out, or delete the rest out. And leave that here. So I've made some changes. I am going to leave the unspecified platform, but I've removed these three right here. And of course, let's run the tests. So when I run RSpec at this point, so let's go back out to our ARC directory. RSpec will find the spec directory and run the test from there. So in this moment, hopefully I will see everything passing, same 19 examples, right? Because if I failed to make an example, it says 19 examples, 0 failures. If I made a problem, like if I hadn't copied something correctly, you know, here, say I don't include this, I would see, or possibly didn't save a file, I should see 18 examples, right? I'll see a less number of examples, so 18 is important. Yep, I'm seeing I'm seeing 18 here, so I am doing it right. I've got my values there. Oops, can't quite circle that. So let's include that example. So that's another way we could refactor it as well. That's a minor change. I think that would ultimately clean up this as well. Now, there's something that we might want to do, thinking about this one right here. So with the final minutes or two, I want to think about how we could even take this further and how we can sort of specify this to make this even a little bit clearer on how we might save ourselves repetition. Because there's something that we haven't talked about yet, is that the chef run object. The chef run object keeps getting created every single time. And it seems like it's such boilerplate, right? It seems like the chef run object, I shouldn't have to define it every single time. It seems like, you know, really the chef run object changes slightly. Again, it's similar to the other thing where if it's being used, it's just being used different with some different parameters, right? And I could kind of pull that stuff out, which is like, let the platform information be this. And I could say, hey, this is your value here. And I'm going to do this like this, right? I could pull this information right here. And I could say, hey, put your platform details here, right? And this really needs to be in a hash. This is hash information. So we could do this as well. So we could call it platform details, right? You know, that kind of thing, I'll call it. We might just call it details. You know, that kind of thing might be useful, right? Because now notice the pattern that can range from this is that really we now see that the chef run object calls the lets, it calls the platform details. Platform details are specified here. And let's just make sure this works. I think this is a good move towards something that might be interesting to see. So this also is going to save us some repetition. So notice that this chef run object, right, is here and now has platform details. And you might be thinking, well, this first context doesn't have anything, right? It has no platform details. Actually, it does. It really, you could write it out. I feel like this is the moment I probably should have paid attention in math class, or maybe this is the moment I paid attention in math class. And the idea that I feel like I see a lot of times with programming is how can I make everything look the same so that way I can treat them all the same and sort of make it more efficient with the process. And maybe that was like the linear algebra or something like that, the one class that I did show up for at least twice. I know I had the book. I'd never read it, but I had the book. I do remember the process of sort of making things look the same. So in our case, we could do the same thing. We could say platform details right here, and we could do a let, and we could say the platform details is this. And really, our platform details is nothing. It's no information. Again, we could use the single line version of it, but then that looks a little weird like this, right? So we could do, we could do a lot of different ways. In this case, it's always about what works clearly. Another option, because none of those really make me feel happy, is we could do a third option, which is we could say hash.new. Really, because this is just doing a hash.new, making a hash object a new one. So you might choose this. It's up to you about what you think would be the best way of handling it. In this case, I'm going to go with that one. So notice this is now, and I'm going to delete this, not for the, well, yeah, I'm going to delete this for the sense of, let's just get this a little bit closer so we kind of see both of them in the same space. So notice how these are so similar to each other, right? We've got the same chef run object, the same sort of chef run object created here, and then we have the platform details that are only different. Similar to like the packages line is different for each one. So remember, we can use that shared example again. The shared example is one thing that sort of allowed us to share some functionality between things. What we can also do is use a shared context. So I'm going to return to the documentation. In this shared example, it did actually allow us to use a let, but this is not an example. There's another thing called a shared context. Actually, it's right here on the left-hand side, so I'm going to click on that. The shared context allows us to define a number of helpers, both methods, let helpers, subjects, and things like that, and store them in a shared context. And then, so this is how you define it, shared context, the name of the context. And then within this, you can say include the context. Right, so we can call a context something and then share that. So I'm going to go back to our code, and very quickly I'm going to go through here, and let's just say this. Let's call this a shared context. Let's call this a chef run, and inside that shared context we define a chef run. And you know, the assumption is that you have to give platform details, but let's just go with this right now. So here, I'll take that chef context. Remember, I can kind of move it up here. I like to keep it inside the same file at first. Before I move it to the spec helper, because we can move that to the spec helper. And how I use this again is, let's return back to the documentation, include underscore context, the name of the context. Include underscore context, the name of the context. So, oops, let's see if that works. I've made a lot of changes, and let's see what happens. So I'll run the test here. Hopefully everything is working. Cross your little fingers, and let's see what happens. The testing gods are with me today. All right, so it looks like everything is passing. So we see that we can even do this with some of these things that we repeat. And so now I can take this include context chef run, and I can even remove it from here, right? I can kind of take that out. And I can now move this shared context to a different file. So I'm going to take this file, move this here, and move this into a spec helper. You know, and that kind of sets it up. Now, one thing that makes me nervous, right? Makes me nervous is the fact of like, what happens when I do this? Like, let's go back to the original default spec. If I were to say not include the platform details, what would happen, right? What would be the result? Like, what would the result look like? Because I could see in the future someone defining a test suite, a new platform, a new thing, making a change, and not seeing this, and then getting an error message that doesn't make a lot of sense to them. They're like, why doesn't this work? What's this magic that's going on? So let's take a look at what the failure looks like. So it tells us undefined local variable or method platform details. And of course, they've not defined it. They're like, should I define one? How do I define one? You know, that kind of thing. So I think what we should do is kind of do what our, well, ChefSpec does anyways, which is, why don't we define, essentially, if you don't define one, we'll give you one, right? So I'm going to take that little code right here, this let the platform details equal a new hash, a blank hash. And I'm going to move that to the spec helper. And when I move it in the spec helper, I'm going to add it to that shared context. Okay, so let's add that to the shared context here. And let's put this at the top. Okay, so this is the shared example. It has a let, oh, no, not shared example. That's why I like to talk out loud. Let, and here's the platform details, right? And here's that hash.new. I think this would probably work. So let's return back to the command line, and let's run this here. And let's see that everything is passing and everything is okay. So if you don't define one, it at least defaults to a nothing, which I think is all right, you know, that kind of thing. And if we look back at our default spec, here, it really kind of cleans up everything. It really, really does. So it makes this things a little bit clearer, and it makes this package include the examples. You know, we could even go a little bit further. Like, why don't we say, you know, if you're always going to be doing a chef run, why don't you always have these things available? So let's cut these out, and let's move these into that spec helper, and let's just make this part of the shared context that kind of goes along with it. So now we don't have to think about it. So, right, we always have a node object. We'll always have access to this like short abbreviated way to access the attributes with whatever example we're in. And that's going to be useful too, because if you look at some of the other examples, I believe Mac is going to look for the tar binary. You know, we could easily do a refactor right here, which is we could say, hey, what's the tar binary supposed to be? Now, I didn't refactor all of this, but we can say, hey, it's supposed to be user bin / this. So we can just really quickly do something like that, as long as it shares the context of the chef run. So I'm going to run this again. All right. That's a lot. So we've done some initial refactoring. Now it looks like we're just about out of time. I'm going to show you one little thing, kind of take a moment just to kind of demo something, because there's still a little bit more refactoring we can do. And I want to show you the final art cookbook, the final refactoring that I've done, as a way to sort of show like what's even more possible here. And that's how we'll finish up here. But if any of you have to run, I understand. Take this opportunity to refactor your tests. You know, just take an hour out of your day and look at ways and sort of examine code. See how you can make it better, clearer, more succinct. And sometimes it's not the right choice. You know, I don't agree with all the choices that I made here, but it can be fun to sort of play with it and see what you can do, because you might find something that you like. As always, practice is very important to this process of being and becoming better at what you're doing. All right, so thank you for all that can stay. For those that can remain, let me show you the final version of the art cookbook, which takes this idea of the shared context even to a further extent. So here, the shared context we're building is setting up a number of additional helpers that are taking care of a lot of boilerplate code. And really, you could say this is for any time that we are testing a recipe. Whenever we test a recipe, we want to make sure we have a chef run happening. We have some platform details that are set up. We always have a node object that are available. Here, you know, we have this cookbook name sort of hard-coded here, but this might be something that we might, you know, figure out. And actually, if I pause the run, I figured out it's actually the described cookbook. You know, there's different things we can do about it. But like I said, let me show you the final ARC cookbook version. So I'm going to open that up, and I've got that in a different directory where I keep a lot of the code that I work on. This implementation of ARC has a number of little interesting things that I learned in the process. So here is on the left-hand side, you're going to see the recipes folder, so spec recipes, and it is broken down by a number of the platforms that I did before. Now let's take a look at one of these recipes right here, the default spec for one of them. And you'll see I did something that looks a little bit different and a little bit cleaner in terms of the implementation. I didn't do this. I didn't take this and turn this into its own sort of little helper. I could have, but didn't. You see, I still have this sort of expected packages. So I liked it that I called it expected packages versus maybe packages, thinking about it now, because it's nice to say expected packages each. I expect the chef run to install this package. So packages maybe not be as clear as sort of like expected packages to have installed. You'll notice here it says define the node attributes. So I didn't use the let, and there might be a reason why. I can't remember what my choice was, but ultimately there's these node attributes, and these node attributes are, I think, what I was calling the platform details, because if you think about it, when you set up a chef run object, with ChefSpec, you're providing all the sort of node attributes along with it. Platform version, and you're kind of overriding or setting some values with it, at least when some of the older versions of ChefSpec. So I came up with this sort of thing here. But one thing that should stand out that's a little different is this right here. Notice it says describe_recipe. So it's not just describe, it's describing a recipe. And I like that it says describe recipe, because I feel like that's kind of that's clearer to me what I'm doing here. And if there is some magic going on, it is a little bit clearer about the magic that's taking place. So I was able to remove from the code this sort of like line here. Let's go back to the spec. I was able to remove this include context by essentially folding it into the chef run into the name up above here. And I want to show you how that's done. So as always, all the tricks and all the sort of secrets are hiding in the spec helper file. And here is exactly what it is. So inside of the RSpec, the spec helper, you can configure it from initially to sort of run. So I'm setting up to run with color. The other thing I'm doing is say, I want to set up this config, I want to alias example group. Alias example group is a way to, and let's copy this and take this to the documentation. So I'm going to return to the documentation here. I'm going to click on this and I'm going to go into a little bit more detail. So alias example, I think alias example group. Let's just write it in English then without alias example. No. It seems that this doesn't show up. I remember this being available. So maybe we should look for the RSpec config. So this is in the config. So we'll take a look at config. Let's go browse in the documentation. I'm going to look at RSpec core and I'll look at configuration. I sometimes like to browse it here. And here's an example groups. And shared examples aliasing. So aliasing, maybe I was typing it wrong. Describe and context are default aliases for example group. You can define your own aliases. So defining an alias is really just a way of providing sort of a different name for it. So you could say describe a thing, describe in broad strokes, details some less important point. So it's kind of like creating a different word for the describe. So you can get away with different describes. You'll notice in my code right here, I called it describe recipe. We could have just called it recipe, right? We could have done something like that as well. So we could have just even made it even more succinct. So the recipe this, and we could get very clear and make our own sort of DSL around the expectation syntax. We could have called this just recipe this, right? We could have gone even further. Recipe this installs core packages. You know, it's up to you, but this is what I chose to do. Now, in this case, looking back at the spec helper, it does something else, which is called type recipe. So it specifies a type. And I want to show you about the type recipe. If you set up a type for it, and you set up a shared context, and you also give it the same type. So notice these types are the same. So here's the describe recipe. Oh, well, let me go back to where it was this. There we go. There's the type recipe. There's the type recipe. So these are exactly linked. If you ever describe or give it a type, and then you define a shared context, you can give it a type. And if they share a type, it will automatically load all of this. And you'll notice here, the chef run will set up a solo runner, sets up the node object, automatically defines a node attributes thing. It also figured out a cookbook name. I think this is before I figured out that there's already a helper within ChefSpec that had a cookbook name. So I made a little bit of a mistake here, sort of working with it in terms of just being, essentially overbuilding something that already existed. You'll see that I also specified cookbook name, recipe name. So I think, like I said, describe recipe, describe cookbook are both there, but I rewrote those. And then I called it default cookbook attribute, which said grab the node object, grab the cookbook name, and grab the attribute name provided. So I built a helper method that's going to return that value for me in those situations. Now, this is an example, like I said, this is the way that you can almost kind of make it a little more magical in terms of how it's done. So we could have done it this way. We could go back to this. We could have said something like this, describe this, and we could say type here. So we could have said type recipe. But like I said, I like sort of aliasing this and then automatic sort of giving this functionality of the thing here. So this is something that, again, you can take that shared concept example and even refactor it further and sort of have it automatically applied to things. And that way you'll see here, what's really nice is that the implementation is so clean in terms of what's being expected. These are the node attributes, which sets up the platform. Here's my packages. And if you open up every one of these files, it's clearer, more succinct about what's trying to happen here. I'll see that across all of them. Red Hat Enterprise Linux, Windows, all of them do that same thing. You know, they all set up the node attributes. They all have the expected packages, whether to install or not install. And then they use that default cookbook attribute, setting the default attributes with them. So again, there's a lot of power inside of RSpec as a testing framework, and that is completely available to you. Sometimes it's hard to know where to find these things, and so I encourage you to actually look at Ruby examples, Ruby screencasts of people exploring RSpec, or watch this video again, and if you want, send me some questions. I appreciate your time meeting with me today, hanging out with me. Thank you very much. Happy automating.